Hey team, and welcome to another magical elections video. This video is going to cover magical elections available to us from the Capricorn full moon until the Leo new moon. So just a 2-week period like normal, but this one's from a full moon to a new moon period. And it's been a minute since we've done one of these. Real life stuff got in the way. It happens. But since we're back and it's been a minute, we're going to go ahead and do a check-in of the planets, where they're at, and kind of what signs are going to be passing through this 2-week period, and whether or not we can kind of reliably get a planetary election from them. The short answer is no, but we're going to go through each one and why. So the first planet we're going to check in on is the moon, and through this time period she's going to move from the sign Capricorn into the sign Leo. So she will pass through Taurus, her sign of exaltation, and Cancer, her sign of domicile. She'll be doing this while she's waning, so the waning phase is a little bit less ideal for moon talismans. Typically, you want the waxing phase. That's kind of the kind of energy that most people are trying to get into, is that waxing growth-oriented energy from the waxing phase. And the waning phase doesn't have a growth-oriented energy. You can, still try to do moon talismans with the moon waning. It's just you have to be doing like a very specific function or looking for a very specific thing to make that worth your while. So then we'll go into when the moon gets into the sign Cancer. Unfortunately, there's not going to be anything really useful there. The sign Cancer is basically canceled until Saturn gets out of Capricorn and the nodes get out of Cancer and Capricorn. So we're waiting for that to happen. Our next planet is Mercury, and you've probably heard Mercury has stationed retrograde and will continue to be retrograde through this whole period, stationing direct on August 1st. So we're waiting at least until then for anything with Mercury. Following Mercury, Venus is going to ingress from Cancer into Leo. There's not really a lot of essential dignity there for Venus, and she's going to be kind of following very closely to the Sun. And that relationship is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about in our next video when we pick up again at the Leo new moon. The Sun is going to move into Leo and gain some essential dignity, and we'll kind of talk more about the Sun as we get through that time period. There aren't a whole lot of opportunities for Sun and Leo talismans. We'll look at one today, but other than that, there's not really a whole lot to say. Part of the problem is that the Sun is going to be kind of close to Mars the whole time through this sign, so we're kind of worrying about that relationship and how the Mars conjunction with the Sun is going to impact solar talismans and solar workings, and then at the same time how the Sun's conjunction with Mars is going to affect Mars type working. So we'll get to that. Mars is going to stay in Leo this whole time period. There's not a whole lot of essential dignity for Mars in Leo, but it's something that we'll talk a bit about more in the next video when we get closer to the Mars-Sun conjunction. And then finally, Jupiter is retrograde in Sagittarius, which is great because Sagittarius is Jupiter's sign of domicile, but it's not great because Jupiter's retrograde, so we can't do anything with it. And then the same thing with Saturn, who's retrograde in Capricorn. It's great that Saturn's in Capricorn, it's domicile, but he's retrograde and there's just not really anything that we can do with him during that time. So in today's video, we only have 2 talismanic opportunities. There's not really a whole lot of good stuff going on right now in the sky. Our planets are kind of busy doing other things and are not placed well for talismans during this time period, and we don't have any good fixed star talismans, primarily because the moon keeps applying to the wrong planets when we're trying to get those. So it's just the way things are sometimes. But since we only have 2, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about eclipses in general. And so this chart here is set for our lunar eclipse on July 16th. The sun and moon oppose each other. It's going to occur in 24 degrees of Capricorn in 4 minutes. And when it comes to eclipses, of course, you don't really want to do any sort of positive or benefic magics, those kinds of things. Eclipses are not good times for those types of rituals. Just the symbolism inherent within them is toxic, is destructive, is life-averse, and so it's really not a good idea to tap into that, especially tapping into that thinking that you're going to get something completely different, right? Like there's a lot of people who talk about eclipses, lunar eclipses especially, as being kind of supercharged lunations, supercharged full moons, very intense, very powerful, and tapping into that is somehow better or more effective than just, full moon type rituals. And they're different, like they're not the same, and saying that it's just a super or amplified full moon is just not accurate. The symbolism is not there to support that. And this is really the difference between kind of traditional historical magical philosophies and more modern ones. It's really been a more modern invention to see eclipses as these kind of super lunations, whereas historically, eclipses has always been discussed as being more negative events or more fear-inducing events. And that's just kind of inherent within the natural cycle of what's happening. The sun or the moon are being covered up in times where they're not supposed to be. There's a severance of life force, and doing magic around that for good things is going to is going to encapsulate that life force severance, and it's going to express it in some fashion. And usually that's things that we don't want to do. We don't want that in a lot of our magics. There are some instances where that can be useful, such as, banishing separations, sacrificing, trying to get rid of something, banishing something, and just being done with something. That's something that you could fall into with an eclipse ritual. Like that's fine. That makes sense. That's symbolically appropriate. The danger here is, there's my cats fighting in the background. The danger here, as I discuss danger, cats fight in the background. But the danger here is just that it's such an intense amount of energy that you might be, basically overkilling the situation, snuffing it out in a way that is overly dramatic or unnecessary, or, just kind of like the unnecessary force of the astrological world. This is it. This is that. So just something to be careful of. So we have about 2 eclipses every 6 months. We have one eclipse, which occurs on either the full moon or the new moon, and then we'll have our second eclipse 2 weeks from then occurring on, the full moon or the new moon, depending on the one that happened before. So if we have our first eclipse on a full moon, our second eclipse 2 weeks later will be on a new moon, and they kind of come in these pairs every 6 months-ish. So because we have about because we have 2 pairs of eclipse every year, about 4 eclipses every year, we actually have more eclipses in one calendar year than we do Mercury retrograde cycles. We usually have about 3 Mercury retrograde cycles in one calendar year. So the question then becomes, how do you pick, or how do you know what eclipses are going to be important for people versus those that just kind of happen? Because for a lot of people, eclipse days are just kind of going to be bad days. Like, like that, a bad day like that. But for some people, eclipses will be really important. And eclipses aren't just things that play out in people's personal lives, but also play out in larger scale things. So a lot of people will talk about, don't worry about eclipses unless they're conjoined or contacting natal points. And that's definitely something to be aware of. A lot of us probably aren't going to have a lot of eclipse stories from eclipses that aren't really connected to our natal charts. But another thing to really consider, especially for those of us who choose to work with eclipse magics, either by doing eclipse rituals, which aren't necessarily that susceptible to this, but things like charging crystals or waters or oils or other materia. Like if that's something that you choose to do during eclipses, which you probably really shouldn't, unless you're specifically doing those eclipse rituals to tap into that more life-destructive or malefic energy, which if that's what you're doing, then by all means do it. Just don't, charge eclipse materia thinking you're going to get something good out of it. That's all I ask. But for people who are doing those things, you're actually not going to get anything from that unless the eclipse is actually visible from your location. So that's something to also be aware of. So like for this eclipse, for the July 16th eclipse, it's not actually visible in the United States of America. So all of us Americans who are trying to, charge eclipse waters or crystals, you're just going to get a regular full moon energy, basically, because that's all that those crystals or the water or whatever materia is going to be subjected to. So just something to be aware of, that there's not only just a natal, an astrological natal component of it, but also a visible astronomical component of where in the world are these eclipses going to fall, who is going to interact with that light or unlight, directly, and what does that mean? So while these eclipses that are occurring now might not necessarily be so important, especially for America, we're talking about since the eclipses of August of 2016, and the country has been on fire basically ever since. So our first talismanic election is going to occur on July 23rd in the kind of late morning hours. And what we're looking for here is, of course, this is going to be a second mansion talisman, and so here we have the moon here in the 21st degree, or in 21 degrees of Aries, 14 minutes within the confines of the second mansion of the moon. And what we're focusing on here really is the application of the moon's sextile to Venus. So the second mansion of the moon is a mansion that's primarily focused on the removal of anger, or the calming of anger, or wild emotions, or things that have gotten kind of out of control. The second mansion is good about kind of reining them in and getting the more dangerous or extreme elements of it out. So you have a fight and you're trying to calm that down. The second mansion is good to help with removing the anger, with removing those kind of visceral immediate reactions to things. So this can be a good mansion to tap into if you're trying to reconcile with somebody, trying to fix a mistake, anything like that. Like, this is a good second mansion thing to work with, but it's very much about removing things, so keep that in mind. It's you're trying to remove a negative emotion or a negative experience with the second mansion. It just takes it away and it supplicates it, or it supplicates the person who's experiencing it and kind of calms them down. So, it's not a bad election, but one of the concerns that we have is that the moon, let me get a different color here. Click. Okay. One of our concerns here is still that the moon is kind of close to the square of Saturn, and that's an issue to work with. It's separating by about 5 degrees, which is a good amount, but even then, it's still pretty close. So just be wary of this. And this is why the chart is set for for an early Aries ascendant, kind of keeping it away from the 16 degrees for the square of Saturn. Just kind of keep that off of keep that out. Just kind of keeping that out of the equation as much as we possibly can. There is a Western Europe equivalent of this chart that's set for kind of roughly the same time. Well, it's more early morning hour. No, it's not. It's kind of roughly the same time, mid morning hours. But in that chart, that one is one that you're going to kind of have to not want to do, just because at that time the moon is much closer to the square of Aries. Like it's at the moon's at like 17 degrees Aries. And so that just puts the Saturn square much more involved in the configuration than it would be otherwise. And the danger there, on the one hand, you might say, oh, well, Saturn's not bad in this situation. What's the opposite of Mars's extreme angry fire? Oh, well, Saturn's, more cool and complacent ice. And there may be an argument there for that, but keep in mind that Saturn's emotions are much more the extreme cold emotion. So instead of the anger and the overt hatred that kind of Mars carries and the anger carries in general, Saturn is much more about like envy, jealousy, plotting, like those kinds of things. So it might just be taking one negative emotion or one spectrum of negative emotions or one spectrum of expression of negative emotions and turning it into a different one. And that's not ideal at all. So for the Western Europe, I wouldn't recommend this one as an equivalent, but this election here for the United States version of it in the mid-morning hours of the 23rd is not half bad. There's issues with it, but it's not a terrible one. So just one to look out for there. So our second talismanic opportunity is actually for the ninth mansion of the moon, Al-Tarf, or the glance. And I'm sure some of you who have been involved in astrological magic a little bit, or have kind of gotten your bearings about electing the charts for talismans, are probably looking at this and wondering why I am showing this chart, because it is not conventionally positive or conventionally good. And the ninth mansion itself is not a conventionally positive mansion. It's very much about destruction, and it's basically a cursing mansion. And so I go back and forth about whether or not to share these kinds of talismans with people, just because on the one hand I don't want to necessarily encourage people cursing one another. Like, that's not fun. But there are more positive uses for these mansions that I think justifies them being discussed and talked about, at least, and being like, oh, hey, here's this thing, it's a part of life, and we have to deal with it. So because the ninth mansion is more of an overtly negative mansion, more overtly about cursing or doing harm, you make the election look like that. Like, you make the chart look like a chart that would hurt somebody or, was otherwise uncomfortable. And that's what has happened here. So we have the moon here conjunct the ascendant within the confines of the ninth mansion at 13 degrees Cancer. We also have the opposition between Saturn being applied to, which is, you would want a harsh application with a malefic planet if we're talking about, cursing or hurting something or, that kind of thing. And then the moon is also conjoined the north node here. So we have the moon conjoined the eclipse point, more or less, conjoined the nodes and all that symbolism or energy that gets involved in that, and it's more destructive, not great, especially for the moon, who suffers, who is eclipsed with the nodes. She and the sun interact with the nodes in a much more real way than say Jupiter or any of the other planets. They don't get eclipsed there, but the sun and the moon do. So the nodes have a more overt, difficult relationship with the sun and the moon than with the other planets. So this would be a really great opportunity on July 30th to make a ninth mansion talisman for. So when it comes to cursed talismans, they're actually really good for pest control. So if you have issues with rodents, pests, wasps, ants, cockroaches, whether literal or figurative, this is a really great talisman to make to get rid of them, or to drive them out of a location, and to assist in your extermination efforts if you're having some, even like things like fleas, ticks, things like that. This kind of mansion election can actually be really beneficial for getting them out. So just throwing that out there for people who may be going through this. I don't recommend obviously making these and handing them out on street corners to curse people or anything like that. But when it comes to pest control and things like that, it can actually be very helpful. Like this kinds of energy tapping into is a very useful way of helping to remove things in like a non-chemical fashion. For those of us who are maybe sensitive to chemicals or have animals that are sensitive to chemicals, this is a great alternative. Alrighty, so those were our 2 talismanic election opportunities for this 2-week period. Just a 2nd house mansion for removal of anger and a 9th house mansion for, pest control, those kinds of things. That's really all we have for this 2 weeks. Waning lunar mansion talismans are always a little bit more difficult to come by, just because a lot of the lunar mansions have more overt waxing or growth oriented properties. So these times tend to be a little bit spare. But what I thought I would do at the same time is show a kind of almost planetary talisman election and talk about why it's not an ideal option for talisman making. So a lot of us get really excited, myself included, when the sun moves into Aries and Leo, just because personally I work a lot with solar magic, but people really enjoy it. People really enjoy solar magic. They really get into it, and it's something that you can kind of always count on just because it's the sun. He's always going to be in Aries at the same times each year. He's always going to be in Leo at the same times each year. Like, that's literally how we calculate the tropical zodiac, is based on his motions. So people always get really excited when the sun moves into Aries and Leo just because they expect more opportunities for solar magics. And while that's generally true, there aren't always good talismanic opportunities that coincide with those 2 months, because it is just 2 months. You have 60 days throughout an entire year where the sun is going to be in his domicile or his exaltation to take advantage of talismanic opportunities, and we don't always get them during that time. It's just how it happens. There's usually a problem with the moon or things like that. And with I gave it away there. With the sun, his problem is going to be with Mars. Mars is going to be involved a lot in almost any kind of solar talisman that you would try to make this year. So like, for instance, this chart here set for July 27th is a example of an almost sun talisman. So here we've got the sun in Leo conjoined the ascendant. That's really great. The sun's strong in his domicile, and we even have the moon applying a sextile to the sun from Gemini. So we have we have the planet angular, we have the planet in a domicile or exaltation, so we have 2 boxes checked off. The moon is applying immediately to the planet that we're trying to make a talisman of. That's a 3rd box that's checked off. That's really important. But our problems are, at this point in time, we either have to choose between, with the sun on this day, on the 21st on this day, with the sun above the horizon, we're worrying about either a Saturn day and a Saturn hour, because it will be sunrise on a Saturday, or we'll be worried if the sun is below the horizon, we'll be working with the Venus day and the moon hour. So we don't have that sun time piece. We don't have the sun ruling the day or the hour during this time, so we don't really have that. But kind of, in my opinion, the bigger issue overall is that Mars is going to be very close to the sun in the 1st house, and having a malefic planet in the 1st house is always really difficult for talismanic construction. We typically don't want that. We want to avoid it at all costs, because we don't want that malefic energy to kind of manifest in the body or the health of the person who will be carrying the talisman or working with the talisman. It's an energy that is embedded in it, and we have to work with it, and we want to avoid it as much as possible. So we'll talk a little bit more about solar talismans, and we'll look for more opportunities for them when we get into the next, when we move on to our next video, when we're talking about the moon from the Leo new moon until the Aquarius full moon. But for now, this is kind of all we have, and I'll see you at the Leo new moon.